Well, usually by the time we get to Friday morning, we can say with confidence this speaker needs no introduction because we've all gotten to know each other throughout the week, and also because the speaker is always John Chauvin. But this year, because his son is getting married tomorrow, John spoke on Monday, and the speaker is Ron Abramitzky. So I will give Ron a brief introduction, perhaps also because we're on camera, but let's not let it change our ways in any other way than this. Ron came from Israel to study economics at Northwestern University. And Northwestern is famous for a lot of things, but in particular, it's one of the major centers in my field of economic history. And he came to Stanford as an economic historian in the year 2005, and I still remember so vividly at the American Economic Association meetings, which is where the job market really takes place, and you have a lot of interviews, and I went to interview, and the very first question that was asked of Ron was, look, you list your field as economic history, but you're studying the kibbutz. And the kibbutz still exists today, and we notice your data come up almost to the present. Why do you call this economic history? And Ron said, well, that's a technicality. It's economic history because I'm an economic historian. Economic history is what I do. And he's really saying economic history is not defined by the dates, it's defined by your outlook, your approach to the problem, your understanding that the economics has to be understood in historical context. And I heard that and said to myself, this man belongs at Stanford. And a few years down the road, I got my wish, and we heard Pascaline introduced as the most recently tenured member of the Stanford economics faculty. Ron was the one just before that. So you are being exposed to the people, as well as some of our younger members, but people who are now moving into leadership positions in the department. And I'm so pleased that it's someone in my own field of economic history. However, he's also well known. One of his credits in the discussions was not just his research accomplishments, but the fact that he's been a star teacher at Stanford. He teaches not Econ 1, but Econ 50, the intermediate micro theory course, which is brutal. I mean, for a major, it's basically a required course. You got a lot of people in there who are not, who really might prefer not to be in it. Econ 1, you can make it fun. Econ 50, they just want to get through, and Ron has had great success at convincing them that they really can do economics, and so he gets top teaching ratings even at this quasi-required course. In fact, he's won not only the department teaching award, but the Dean's Teaching Award in 2012. In fact, those of you who have been coming for a while have already seen Ron. He gave two previous presentations, one his work on the kibbutz and the other his work on immigration. And really, that's the reason that he's on the organizing team. Both the response to the teachers, from the teachers was so positive, but also Ron said immediately, he enjoyed it so much, can I come back and do it again? So we said, okay, we want to institutionalize this impulse while it's fresh. And he's now he's now part of the team. So today, I think he is talking about work. Notice that he has streamlined his title compared to the one that was put out. Here it is in front of me. Work related to his work on the kibbutz, but I think taking a broader cut at the question of schooling and the returns to education. What could be more appropriate for a group of teachers? Right.
So thank you, Gavin, for this generous introduction. You know, as I was coming here today, I was like, am I really going to teach teachers about teaching today? Was that the right strategy to take? And then, you know, like, I'm not going to teach you anything you don't know about teaching, of course. I'm just going to discuss with you some economic perspective to the, to the issue of schooling and education. And I really hope this will be a discussion because, you know, like, I don't know if you guys know, but it's really warm our hearts to see how every year you guys are so happy, you know, and appreciate this opportunity and enjoy it. But I'm not sure if you know that the speakers do too. So, like, all our speakers always come and say how great and fun experience this was. And you know, for more than one reason, you know, like it's both that you guys are great, smart, intelligent, engaged audience, but it's and also that it kind of force people to step a couple of steps back from what they do and teach it and talk about it in a more accessible way. But it's not just, you know, accessible. It's not just a cheap statement here. It clarifies your thinking. You know, when you're too close to what you do, you tend to take, you know, once they said, you know, that an academic field is a set of people who decided to not question their own fundamental assumptions anymore. So at some level, you know, like when you kind of have to engage with a broader intelligent audience, it forces you to, you know, think again about what it is that seems obvious to you and to learn from them a lot. And definitely that's how I've been feeling, you know, like in the last few years when I gave talks here. So I really want this to be a discussion rather than just me kind of, you know, talking at you. The other thing is, you know, I don't know if, you know, like this is not our daily life either. Like the way we, you know, even not in our professional conferences, I think this is an exceptionally, you know, well-organized conference. And I just want to take this opportunity because I'm the last speaker to thank again Daphna and Ben, you know, for making this all happen. So, okay, so basically my plan today is I'm going to spend maybe the first hour talking about, generally about what does economics have to say about schooling and education? Does it capture a lot of what education is about or not? What do we think about it? And then the second part of the presentation to talk about some research that I've done in the area, and then if we have time, about my broader research project. If not, I'll just do that next year. So it's like, it's really not that I have to cover, you know, like material here. You know, as much as I go this year, I'll continue next year. So it's, you know, so how big are the returns to education would be like one of the first questions that economists would ask. And what do you think? If you think about like the monetary returns to education, what do you think are the average return for a year of schooling in the job market? Very good. Well, having said this, what do you think would be? Yeah, it does depend on how you measure it. It depends on, you know, like how do you capture it, and then absolutely that will be a big part of what you major in, where you major in, you know, like and so on. That's true. But any kind of rough guesses? Yes. Sorry. Okay.
It also depends on how much money you spend for school. If you spend not so much money and you become an electrical engineer, that's going to have a different outcome than if you spend a lot of money and become a teacher.
Anybody else? And by the way, you can use the microphone if you want to be heard in the, so this is kind of, we thought it would be nicer to share the video rather than the slides, and we experimented with this, but we also don't want to change the nice dynamics that we have. So whatever, if you feel comfortable talking to the mic, that's fine. If you feel comfortable to just ask, and yeah, whatever you guys, yeah.
There is some concern about whether or not students that select schools that are for profit don't actually get a very good return on their investment.
You know, you guys remind me of my colleagues, you know, I'm asking them a question, tell me a number, and, you know, we are like, you know, it depends on the one hand, on the other hand, I'm not sure, you know, like where you go. You know, but of course, that's the right answer. It's the right answer because there is no really magic number. So the right answer is to ask, what are we measuring? You know, is it private or public? What does it depend on? And that's kind of exactly what I plan to discuss. But yes.
I think geography has a big impact. My major was government, and I think, and I wanted to go into a career with government.
Right.
And I think had I been on the East Coast, I would have done it instead of having become a teacher.
So occupational choice and you know, the returns to schooling definitely depend on where you are. Unfortunately, we can't, you know, like we know that you know, like this idea of like mobility for depending on where you start is persistent, as we've seen here a couple of times. It's not like, the idea of equal opportunity for everybody. It doesn't matter where you start, you will get to the same place. Is unfortunately not always the case. So this is absolutely right. What about the elementary school? I mean, you think colleges, but what about the returns to graduate from high school, or which also, of course, depends on everything that you say. But
this is reported on in the press all the time.
Yep.
But I can't remember those numbers
Okay.
exactly in terms of ratios. But the last thing I saw, I believe, showed that it's widening. The returns to education are widening, and I think now the differential between a high school graduate and a college graduate in the aggregate is something like $1 million over their lifetime.
So it's absolutely true that one of the main trends we see in the, starting the 1980s is a widening gap between college graduates and high school graduates. This premium for, college is kind of increasing, over the last 30 years. Is it exactly $1 million? I don't know. It again depends on calculations. I would say if there is a takeaway number, people believe that, again, just measuring from the narrow economic, monetary perspective, returns to schooling vary, in the US vary anywhere from about 7 to 12% per year of schooling.
And I would just add, for those who think the teachers are so poorly paid, because that's just about all you hear from teachers when they talk about it. They foremouse their incomes, returns to education for a college, for a public school teacher. They vary tremendously from state to state, and teachers are an affluent class, and the sooner they realize that, the more in touch with reality they will be. And they do not suffer in general, although the funding crises have certainly affected younger teachers greatly. They do not suffer from the kinds of market risks that people in high tech do from time to time. And at the end of the day, and as John suggested, there will undoubtedly be a rejiggling of stirs because it is just financially unsustainable. Very few people today, unlike the 1960s, and so when they retired on GM pension plans and things like that, have the benefits of teachers. And to compound that, if you had the total compensation for teachers, teachers are indeed, public school teachers are indeed a very affluent group.
Okay, so this is, this idea of when you choose an occupation, on the one hand you have, there are risky occupations that on average pay more, but they have more risk versus maybe pay less, but they are kind of more, have more insurance, because you, that's true. I will make the case though that, arguably you should be earning more a little bit. Right. Yeah, but let's hear more people.
Mila's California-centric view of teacher compensation notwithstanding, I think the answer to the question is huge, and yet as educators, we're dealing with individuals. So when I read economic stuff in the papers about the returns to education, it tends to be either a sort of almost elitist pro-professional narrative of everyone should be aspiring to be an engineer. And that doesn't fit all of the actual human beings in my midst.
I don't know if you read the right newspapers. That's definitely
perhaps not, but
it's definitely not where there is, I'm sure there is a cheap version, but I hope you will see here that economists have taken quite wide-ranging approach to, and to think about not just from the perspective of everybody should go to an elitist perspective and
right. So I guess my question is,
Yeah.
how does that all break down for different groups? And I assume
Right,
that
so-
some of the
yeah.
research you're about to share
Yes,
is going to
exactly.
show us
Yeah, so you will see.
how big the returns are for
Exactly.
various populations.
And also one of the things I'll be saying is that it's not all about money. And so you will see that as well, yeah.
I have a question, perhaps for now or for later, but how much of this is about returns to schooling, and how much of it is it return to skill, and how much of it is it return to credential?
Exactly. So this is this is exactly the right. So basically, you preview very well everything that I'm going to talk about. It's exactly the kind of questions that you should be asking, and and in fact, it has been very challenging. One of the challenges has been to measure this. How do you measure the returns to schooling where it is confounded with so many other things? For example, as you mentioned correctly, returns to education, the gap, the premium of having a college degree over having just a high school diploma increased dramatically over the last 30 years. But a couple of other things changed over the last 30 years. So how do you tell how much of this increase is because of this is a key challenge that we have, and you will see a number of approaches people have taken, and I'm going to give you some perspective on that. But again, I want to. It's very interesting to me to see whether you think, what do you think is missing? Where do you think, research can still learn more from your experience as teachers? And that's exactly why I chose this topic.
I was just thinking about the question of the sort of widening gap, and then reflecting on what we heard earlier this week about the decline in sort of those routine manual jobs, and
Right.
how much of the increase in the gap is due to a loss of a sector
Right.
in the population that used to be fairly well compensated.
Yes. So I think that my view on this is close to Luigi's view on this, which is, the bank teller is is a profession that we are going to lose, and is not likely to come back with advances in technology that automatize things. I don't think anybody believes that teachers can, the core job of a teacher can be automatized, and the technological advances are likely to take to take that part. Aspects of your jobs that are perhaps more boring and mundane will disappear, but that I would say is a good thing, potentially, because it kind of gives you more time to do the things that the parents hope, hope for, for their children, spending more time with the kids, and those things in human interaction, in the value of teachings that cannot be replaced by, regardless of technology. So I don't think that teaching is one of these occupations that is.
That actually wasn't what I was
Sorry.
asking. I understand, and I totally
Yeah.
agree with your comment. My question was, if we lose these bank tellers, these other
Right.
unionized jobs, and we're now talking about the gap between college-educated and others in the workforce who don't have a college education, how much of that gap is that the bottom is going down as opposed to the top is going up?
We'll talk about this. Let's talk about this. Yeah. Good. So, so let me move on a little bit. We'll have just to kind of tell you a little bit what I'm planning to do, and then feel free to ask questions. But let's advance a little bit just to see what I'm planning to do here. So, here is the big picture view. Okay. So countries with more educated population are richer. That's a fact. So, clearly, if we want, Haiti, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua to do as well as the US, we must invest a lot in education. That will bring them to the level of the US. What do you think? What do you think about what I just said? Does that make sense? It makes some sense, but it's overstated dramatically. This is a correlation between education and occupation, education and income. But I want to remind you before I even go, before I continue, that correlations are not always causal. So I don't think many people, there is a very strong correlation between between Facebook users, the number of Facebook users, and the Greek financial crisis. It is in fact stronger probably than the correlation between education and income. And yet I don't think many people will claim that Facebook is responsible for the Greek financial crisis. So I think so I think it's very, very dangerous. It's dangerous to make strong conclusions of causality based on simple correlations. And so that's just kind of a ridiculous example. But I think when we see examples that tend to be more in line of what we think, we tend to want to assign those causal interpretation, but we have to be careful about this. Here's another one. So here's a baby that read the article that kids of teens' moms are twice likely not to graduate than kids whose moms were over age 22. And was very sad because he thought he was twice as likely not to graduate high school because he had a teen, because he had his mom had this as a teen. This is again, it's correlations are not causal. Like whether people who marry as teens could be different than people who marry as grown-ups in ways that will generate a correlation between teens, pregnancy, and educational outcomes that have nothing to do with a causal effect. So I kind of so this is at the same time, and this I probably have, and this I our colleagues remind ourselves is that we got so obsessed also sometimes with this, with kind of getting at causality. Sometimes correlation is likely causal. So my stomach hurts. Maybe it was the bad tuna I had for lunch. Too bad I don't have a proper control group. Now I will never know. So sometimes it is likely causal, but it's just kind of like to warn you not to when you kind of overthinking about the statistics as we do. Sometimes we tend to really only believe the causal relationship if we see a smoking gun, and still there are some interesting questions that correlations definitely don't imply causation, but they also don't rule them out. So here's another one. I used to think correlation implied causation. Then I took a statistics class. Now I don't. Oh, sounds like the class helped. Well, maybe. I don't know. could be other things. So with that, yes, does education? So yes, there is strong correlation between education and income. Does it mean education? More education lead to higher income? Maybe, probably to some extent, but not necessarily. Reverse causality is a big issue here. Richer countries can afford more education. That will generate a positive correlation in the data between education and income that have nothing to do with the causal effect of education. There are also other factors, could be other factors like, your motivation is something that determines both whether you are going to be educated and how much income you will earn. This will generate a correlation between education and income that again has nothing to do with causality. So it's while very, very intuitive, the approach that higher education leads to higher income, it's not, correlation themselves don't imply causation, and indeed one of the key challenges in the economics of education, and I would say in applied microeconomics more generally, has been teasing out causality from correlation. So I would say that a lot of the advances in applied micro in the last 20, 30 years has been to try to find settings and creative research designs that tease from these correlations, some sense of causality. Okay, so that's another thing. And so if I'm to take an economic view, so if I'm to summarize the economic view of education, in a couple of slides, I would say there are two broad views about education and how it matters. One views education as investment in human capital. So education, the concept of education as an investment, something you do now, just like an investment in physical capital, you invest in your human capital with the hope to get a return for that investment. And so human capital is this broad general term, kind of a catch-all almost, used by economists to refer to the stock of knowledge and attributes used by a person that creates value, economic value, so that increases the value of his kind of like labor in the labor market. So something that, some knowledge and good characteristics that you have that make him more productive on the job. And so starting with Gary Becker and, that we, who, by the way, a Nobel Prize winner who just passed, just died recently and made major contributions to economics, and also the work of Ben Porath, that we're the first to point out that education can be thought of as an investment in human capital. Education improves our human capital and makes us more productive in the labor market. And so from that perspective of education, the reason why we acquire education is to become more productive, which will translate into higher wages, when we grow up, and kind of that's a key reason of why we acquire education. An alternative economic view of education is forget about education as investment for a second. Think about education as a signal of inherent ability. I want to signal that to the employer that I'm pretty smart, pretty bright, and that I will earn a lot. So even if education doesn't matter much, just the fact that I have an MBA from from Harvard or Stanford, signal that I was able to get in, that I'm probably smart, even if I didn't get anything. It's not to say that you don't get anything in MBA schools, but I'm just saying even if it didn't have any added value to your human capital, just the fact that it signals that your high ability can be important. So the underlying idea behind this is that, oftentimes desirable worker attitudes like perseverance and ability are very difficult for employers to observe. And schooling can be used to signal high ability if it is less costly for high ability people to study. So if, very bright people that are that have high ability and they kind of are very motivated, if for them going to school is easier than for people who are lazy and don't have much ability, then this will provide a way for high ability people to signal of their high quality for employers. And again, this is even if education in itself is totally useless. Again, it's not to say that education itself is totally useless, but it provides an alternative way through which education may be useful in the job market. Education is a signal. I would say that in general it is very hard. This is one place where I can't report you much progress in the research on economics of education. It is very hard to disentangle whether the returns to schooling are because education improves skill or because education signals some inherent skills. It's probably a mix of both. And I haven't seen convincing research designs that tease apart these two. So I will just kind of leave it at that give you the two kind of economic motivations to study, or monetary returns to study. In a second, I will say that maybe this is not everything, but we don't really know how much each of them contributes to the motivation to study. Yeah. You want a microphone, or you're fine, or you want a microphone? You're fine.
So way to test it, when you say Stanford would be very difficult to get into, maybe allowing a certain investment to come in, it doesn't matter what the grades are, all right? And as you follow them to see how successful they are.
Yeah. No, fabulous, even better, randomly assign. Randomly admit people of, to Stanford, and then see how they do. If you randomly assign them, you know that it's not because of the signal, although it could be, even that could be signal because, for people for whom it is easier to go through the 4 years. So maybe randomize them to Stanford and make the program very easy, and then see kind of like how they do later. So it is just, but you're exactly touching the point. It requires some creative design that either fixes that either kind of like allow you to focus on the signaling and shut off the investment in education part, or shut off the investment the signaling and focus on the other. And it's just hard to do in observational data, and we don't usually randomize things when it comes to schooling and education. Right. Sometimes we do, but and I'll talk about these two. Yeah.
I was going to say there is one example. It's not at college level, but for charter schools in many places, by rule, by law, they have to assign people at random. And if you had charter schools that are oversubscribed, they put into a lottery.
This is a very good point. And in fact, if the better advances on this kind of research is coming from charter school, and in fact, we have the world expert. Like in education and in particular on charter school here in Stanford, Caroline Hawksby, and we hope to bring her to talk here in the next over the next couple of years, and this is exactly where a lot of the progress has been made. So with that, the private. So what are the returns to education really? I would kind of separate them into private returns and social returns. Okay? So the private returns, and again, we are focusing for now on the monetary returns, just pure money, just if you do it just for the money, okay, not for anything else for a second, then the private return to education is how much we expect our education to translate into higher wages. Okay? I'm just looking and I'm thinking, will my education translate into higher wages? That is my private returns from acquiring this level of education. And then we would expect that the higher is the return to education, the more incentives we have to acquire more education. And that's an area where I've done research, and I'm going to talk about this in the second half of the talk today. There is also social returns to education. So education is one of these goods, if you want, that have this positive externality built into them. So giving one person more education increases other people's output, not just their output. So, educated workers, they bring new technology, they bring new information, they are better able maybe to organize teams. They bring with them qualities that we think make everybody else around them more productive. And so just the opposite of, say, smoking. So smoking, when you think about whether to smoke, there are private returns, Yeah, it's not healthy, but I love it. But there is also the social aspect, which is you make everybody else around you worse off. And so for the same reason, we want to tax as a society, because people don't usually think about society when they make their private decisions. So when they think about whether to smoke or not, they really just trade off between how much they like it versus how much health problems it will cause them. Similarly, in education, most people think about their costs and returns of private costs and returns of acquiring education, but maybe they don't think as much about the social value of it, about how they make others more productive. And so when there is an externality like that, just like in the case of smoking, we want to tax smoking because as a society, we want to make it more costly for people who smoke, given that this creates this negative externality on everybody else. In education, because it helps everybody else, we want to subsidize it. We want to encourage people to study because on their own, maybe they choose lower level of education than is desirable by society as a whole. Okay? So that's the social returns to education, and one reason why government, finance, often helps and finance education. Not surprisingly, sometimes, so for example, I don't know why I pick up on MBAs today, but you will find fewer programs, MBA programs, that will actually subsidize your study. Why? Because in MBA studies and in law schools, you believe that the private returns are high enough that, people will reap their own, benefits from investing in their education, and that's not a place where you think that, a lot of government intervention is required to make it easier for people to, to study MBA and become rich later. But in primary education, high schools, perhaps fields where we think, nursing, teachers, where we think that there are not enough people who will choose it based on their private returns. This is where we see, we expect to see more investment in education. And so this is going back to your point. So we understand conceptually what returns to education are, what economists tell us about them, but how do we measure them? So how do we measure them? So this has been very, very challenging. So again, selection bias is a key problem here when you want to measure the returns to education. Those people who choose to go to school might have done better even if they didn't. Those perhaps motivated people from advantaged backgrounds, people with a lot of connections, they are the first to go to school, but they would probably earn more than people who didn't go to school, even if they didn't spend a single day in school. That fact in itself creates a positive correlation between education and income that is not part of how education helps income. And so the challenge has been to try to tease apart this part that is causal, education cause higher income, versus the selection of certain people into education. And I'm speaking here in broader terms, but just to kind of give you a sense. And so there are some very creative research designs used by economists to actually try to get at this causal effect a little bit better. And I will not discuss them in great length, but I will just put references here, and if you want the references, I can give it to you after. But, one approach has been to, to compare twins. So, Norway is fabulous for researchers in giving us access to great data. There is, there is access for some researchers for the entire population of Norway, where we know a lot about them, and we know about their attitudes and about their schools and income, very reliable, high quality data. And because the data is so large and it's not just a sample, it allows you to say, look at all the twins in Norway. And then, why is it useful to look at, why it could be useful to look at twins? Because you might think that if you compare twins, they share, they grew up in the same place, the same house, so all this idea of like growing up for richer family doesn't play a role. Even unlike siblings, maybe the parents got richer when the second kid grew up, or maybe maybe the parents, were tired by the second kid and didn't invest as much in him. This is also something that we can control for when we look at twins. They share, they even share some, arguably they share more of their genes, than siblings. So it's kind of like it's potentially controlling for many things that are usually, we have selection, over like. So then the idea was to compare twins with different levels of education. And the finding in Norway has been that twins with 1 more years of schooling earn on average 4.8% more than their less educated twin. So a couple of things. First, this is lower than the simple correlation between education and income, but it is still substantial. And a second thing is you could still think that, why does that twin go to school and his other twins didn't? So there is still, there is an inherent selection still, but, they argue, you could argue that, so that will be more telling about the causal effect of education if if twins who get 1 more year of education do so just because they met a friend and he convinced them, or something that is unrelated with their inherent abilities. So even twin studies have been challenging to, for that. Yeah. Yeah, no, I don't think so. But although just because of the size of the data. Right. Yeah, so it's big enough because, it's big enough because it's the entire population. Over the entire population, there are and I'm sure they have specifications in their table that kind of focus on only identical twins, and that's conceptually that's even more interesting. I suspect it's more of a data of you kind of need enough sufficient data to allow you to identify effects like that. You had a question, Louis?
Yeah, I was wondering if this takes into account the U.S. model is that MBA 2 years or 4 years.
It's a very good question. The question was, does it take into account that some programs are 2 years and some programs are 4 years, so in these particular studies I don't remember. But in general, it's a very good question, and definitely there is a sense of a year of schooling, from 3rd grade to 4th grade is quite different than moving from the master to a PhD, a year in the PhD. Generally, I think that it's safe to say that many studies kind of find that it's diminishing. So the returns to schooling kind of decline. They are always positive, but they kind of decline the more schooling you have, like diminishing returns, if you want, to schooling. And it's very high in elementary school, and it kind of declines. There has also been attempts to study, what's the returns of going to an elite school versus like a public school and things like this that I'm not sure I will touch much on. But definitely there is always a sense that yes, returns to schooling vary a lot. This is one, I'm here just giving you these examples because they were kind of like clean from the measurement perspective. So I'm just here in this slide, I just want to make the point that how can we overcome the measurement issue? That it's hard to disentangle selection from actually returns. Also, Norway in general is quite different than the US. Norway is more egalitarian. The welfare state is stronger in Norway. Like, arguably the returns to schooling in the US is larger than the returns to schooling in Norway. And so that you have to take this number with a grain of salt. It's kind of for Norway, for that design, for looking at like particular group. The other approaches, another approach, starting with a classic paper by Angrist and I forget the other co-author, Kruger, is to look at the changes in compulsory schooling laws in the U.S. So you know how the U.S. kind of over the years, some states started to introduce a minimum level of schooling, and that kind of introduces like if you want an exogenous shock, a shock to the degree of education required by the population that is kind of like coming from the sky, from their perspective. Oh, from now on I have to study more years than I planned to. And that is a useful variation to use in research because it allows you to tease the cause, better the causal effect of education on income. And using those designs, they found that 1 year of extra schooling, again, that is coming from these compulsory schooling laws, increase earnings by 13%. So, there are various estimates out there. Again, they range from, in the US, from 7 to 12%, vary by a lot of things. But this is just to illustrate how the difficulty in actually measuring it. The other thing is, what about the costs of education? So we focused on the returns to education, but there are definitely also costs to have education. It's not free in more than one way. So the easy way to think about the cost, so let's think about college for a second, or like private schools, or in general schools. There is a direct cost: tuition, fees, books, room and board if you talk about college. The direct fees that it costs you to acquire that education. So those are easy to measure, and again, they vary by public, private schools, but those are kind of costs that are very easy to think about. But there is a cost that is at least as important, and and I think, and somehow somehow this I think is one of the key concepts in economics, by the way, opportunity cost. And I'm still not sure how many, how many people understand this. Even among our undergrads, it's always kind of it's always a concept where when I teach it, I kind of pause for a second and I kind of talk about, and I don't know if you have the same experience in high school, but the idea that there is also, there is a big difference between accounting cost and an economic cost. Accounting cost, just have a balance sheet and count how much did I pay for books, how much did I pay for tuition, how much did I pay for room and board, you sum it, that's the cost. But for decision making in general, economic cost is more important. Economic cost also includes the opportunity cost. So when I attend college for 4 years in Stanford, then I give up working and earning money for those 4 years. When I decide to open my own startup business, I give up working for Google, because I'm starting my startup. So when I make a decision whether to go to school, whether to have my startup, any decision really like that, I have to think not just about the direct cost, but about the opportunity cost of foregone earnings that I will experience during my years of school. And so that's an important cost to think about, which of course is harder to measure. Yes. You want a microphone? So that they everybody can hear it then later when they watch the video.
In Econ 1A, I would pose the question, can you name a former Stanford student who dropped out because the cost was too high, and they all knew, because it's in the textbook, Tiger Woods?
Exactly.
And John Taylor would say Tiger Woods was the quickest student he ever had. No sooner was he exposed to the concept of opportunity cost than he went out and began making millions on the golf circuit.
It's a great point, but also you just took away one of my jokes that is coming in a couple of slides. So, and then again, there is the government expenses on education, which is estimated, I'm not sure how reliable it is, I didn't look into this too much, but, about 5% of GDP on average, is spent on education in this country, and but don't hold me, don't hold me accountable for this number. But, okay, so then we understand how economists think about college and, what your priors are for education. So here's the question, should I go to college? So should everybody go to college? Should I go to college? What do you think? Yeah. 1 second. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask about the GDP figure.
The thing I was not sure I know what I'm talking about, you mean?
No. No, because 30 years ago, 40 years ago, was the GDP much higher, of percentage of GDP?
Yeah. So it will be interesting to see what happened to the percentage of spending on education over the last year. This is really, I'm not an expert in general in this topic, so I wouldn't know this, but it's an important number to know. I don't know, maybe Gavin, do you know if yes, I'm not sure, but I'm not sure. Should I go to college? Yes.
Or in business or law.
The point here was it's very different if you take a degree in art history or if you take an MBA. Absolutely, a degree in history, will have a lower return than a degree in MBA. And from the economic perspective of thinking about should I acquire education, that's kind of one thing that people think about.
Yeah, and I saw an article about this. I think if you want an actual number, per year of college, I think for Stanford or Harvard, it was 15%, and for a lot of for the worst schools on the list, it was definitely negative.
So the point is that the returns to education vary a lot. They vary within a school by field. So even within Stanford, whether you do art history or computer science, will definitely have different returns. And also across schools, maybe some schools, in some schools, people, perceive to have higher returns. We have to remind ourselves that there is the cost issue as well, though. And that's kind of where I'm going with this also. But absolutely, the returns, it's a very good point. The returns vary a lot by individual, by school, by field. They vary a lot. And that's one consideration, that people take when they think about whether to go to college and what to study and where. Yeah. Sorry.
When you get a college education, you're more likely to be healthy. You're more likely to make better decisions. You're more likely to have a better relationship and all of those things. And I understand that we have a hard time matching correlation to causation. But there's a lot of data out there that suggests that highly educated people tend to do better off. So
absolutely.
I would say...
Absolutely. And this is where I'm going with this, by the way. This is absolutely, it's an absolutely great point. So between all of you, the joke level now will kind of go down because I will, but it's absolutely true. We are focusing here on the, I'm starting here with the monetary returns to education. If we are just if we are just care about money, and we are making the decision selfishly, thinking about the money aspect of it, that's kind of one thing. But when we ask the question, should I go to college, I don't think that that we only have to think about whether we will earn more money or not. There are a couple of other important things in life, like how healthy you are, how patient you are when you make later decisions in life, how fun it is to be, in school, how much your social life will improve, and various other things. And just the fact that they are harder to measure don't make them any less true. And in fact, this is where you will see where there is some advance in this research as well, trying to capture some of this non-monetary thing. But it's definitely part of the returns to college is not just monetary, and that's where I'm going with these two. So those are fabulous points. I will continue, but please, if you have any other questions or comments, let me know. So this is a tough question. Let's break it down to, first, should I go to college if I only care about making money? And then let's think about, should I go to college if I care about things other than money too? So, but let's kind of to focus to make it very simple and concrete. And it is, and after all, people do think about whether they will earn more money after they go to college. Let's ask the question, should I go to college if I only care about money? So, there are reasons of why yes, there are reasons of why not, and there are reasons of why the answer for this is different for different people. And so, why yes? Well, maybe I expect to earn much more. If I think that if I go to study computer science in Stanford, then my salary will quadruple. Then it's a kind of rational decision. Even if I just care about money and I can tolerate computer science, but again, this is a question of how much I like what I do. That's again, we are now focusing just about if I care about money. Then if I think that the returns for me to going to Stanford and study computer science is very, very high, that's one reason to go to college. And to study computer science. But why not? There are a couple of reasons of why not that have to do with the costs. So one kind of cost is, tuition could be too high to justify going. So here is a caricature that I like. Why should I go to college? He asked the guidance. You can get a degree. Why? You can get a good job. Why? So you can make more money. Why? So you can pay back your college loans. So this circular idea where if you just think about money, if you go to college and what it buys you is the ability to repay your student loans, then you could have done other things in this in these 4 years. If you think there is an opportunity cost, this already makes it not a smart choice to go to college if all you go is because you want to repay your loans, right? So that's the idea of the costs. Here's an example of, the costs doesn't justify always, to go to college if you think only about money. The other side also has to do with cost, is the Gavin's point. The opportunity cost of attending college is just too high for some people. For Mark Zuckerberg and for, Bill Gates, the direct costs probably didn't mean much. But the opportunity cost of attending college meant that they couldn't start Microsoft and Facebook, and it didn't seem to justify spending a couple of more years and graduate from Harvard and giving up founding Microsoft and Facebook. And that is and that is a decision that is is rationalizable. It's like they basically drop out of college because it was not worth it for them to continue. The opportunity cost of attending college was just too high. So cost, again, is not just the notion of direct cost. For the other guy, it was the direct cost. But, for some people, it's the opportunity cost. Of course, there is a famous story I remember from Israel. I think it was AOL was created by, there were 3 kind of students in Israel who wanted to create this AOL. And then, one of the moms said, why do you do this thing, Luftgeschäfts of, just air businesses of doing something on the internet? Get a degree, go have something concrete that you can use, and then, at some point you can do your little things, and just and convinced him to drop out. And then AOL sold for $400 million a couple of years after he decided to kind of attend law school, and he was a little bit upset about about all of this. So, it's not, just to make a point that opportunity costs sometimes make it, it's too high to attend college. And again, but for most people, of course, the opportunity cost is not as high. Yeah? So these are, of course, looking at kind of extreme examples. So let's make it a bit concrete, more concrete for a second. So imagine again, I just care about money. Should I go to college? Imagine I just graduated from high school. I received a job offer, to work for $40,000 annual salary in one of the, one of the companies maybe here at Silicon Valley for a high school degree. $40,000 per year seemed quite a nice offer. And And I'm thinking, should I take the offer right now, or should I go to college instead? So assume that the private returns is like the average of what people find in the US. Maybe it's 10% per year of schooling. Abstract from the fact that it's maybe it's 15% for elementary school and 13% for high school and 9% for college. Abstract from this for a second, just for the simplicity of making the argument. Let's say it's 10%. But of course, you can easily, recalculate it using numbers that you think make more sense for you. So assume the private return is 10%. And again, as we discussed, in reality, it depends on many things. And so after 4 years in college, your annual salary will be, if you think a similar job opportunities will come, your annual salary will be $58,000 after spending 4 years in college. It's like, and so when you say, okay, so what's $58,000? Imagine now that you are kind of planning to work for 30, 40 years, earning $58,000 instead of 40. If you calculate how much this is worth, of course it will depend on the interest rate. If the interest rate is high or the interest rate is low, but just kind of rough calculation, it's kind of over your lifetime, this could translate into about $400,000 to $500,000 in present value over your lifetime. So basically, just calculating from the point of view of today, how much the entire stream of money of more earnings will be worth of you today if you go to college versus you don't, it's about $400,000 to $500,000 with this example that I gave here. And so, if you just think about money, if education cost for you is less than $400,000, then you should go to college. And again, though, it's important to remember that for $400,000 is all costs. It's not just the direct cost of like the fees of fees and tuition and room and board. Also should include the opportunity cost of, when you go to college, though you will not work for 4 years. You could have earned the 40,000, times 4, like if you don't work. And so the calculation, all of those costs together, if they come to be less than $400,000, in this example, you should go to college based on pure wanting to make more money idea. And so, for many people, these calculations justify going to college. Again, it didn't for Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg, but for most of us, it does. Or for many of us, it does. And again, this is especially true, you mentioned this point, which is a good point. It's especially true because the returns increased substantially since the 80s. And, we do have some evidence that, over the years, as the college premium increases, we see more and more people attending college. That is consistent with the idea that when the returns are higher, more people attend college. But of course, it's kind of hard to know whether this is the reason, because a couple of other things happened in the last 30 years, but it's consistent with this idea. Yeah?
Fixing their salary in place. That's their starting salary, and they're never promoted. They're holding fast. So isn't signaling kind of part of this? How much, if you're starting at $40K and you think that you can do that job and do it well and learn things for the next job on that career ladder, that's a different proposition than if you think your future bosses aren't going to respect you and you're going to be permanently disadvantaged for lack of the credentials.
Exactly. So this is a very to make it concrete, I make these assumptions. You can change them though in any way you want, and and for example, one of the things is I assume here that you will earn $40,000 forever or $58,000 forever. But usually there are some increases, even 1% here, per year, here and there, and those actually will tend to make it the 58 larger than the 40, because the compounding interest is very, very strong idea. At the same time, you got to be thinking, and this is abstracted from here. If I go, the 4 years that I now work as a high school student, what will it signal to the job market? Exactly like if you believe in the signaling idea, what will it signal? So, it could, on the one hand, you did gain 4 years of experience. So if you believe that returns to experience in whatever it is that you do is really, really important, much more than formal education, then you give up 4 years of experience, and that could change the numbers here. Could also mean, on the other hand, that you didn't signal that you're high ability by going to study, and employers are going to view this kind of not very favorably. So there are many other considerations to kind of think about here, but it's just like it's just a simple example, and you can and you can customize it at some level in any way you think the world works, and do the calculation. And it's quite simple in terms of the ideally it's simple. But again, this is just an example. Yes, I mean, and even if we just think about this, the idea of starting to earn more money, for many, it's returns to schooling vary a lot by individuals, and they are not constant. Everybody has different returns, of course, and different considerations. It is, though, true that research tends to find that returns to schooling are highest for the disadvantaged students. So, the low-skilled people actually have higher returns to schooling. There are a number of reasons why this may be the case, but one simple one is just because they are still not on the flat diminishing return part of their education, and so, having even a little bit, education, have a higher returns than when you have, more of it, and so the returns to schooling are actually, on average, higher for the disadvantaged students. And again, we talked about opportunity cost, so I will not repeat this. The other thing, and so, okay, so this is money. Should I go to college if I care about things other than money? So here is one example. So before I go there, let me take your question.
As far as the opportunity cost of attending college, I think that's for just to get the formal degree. But I mean, even in Zuckerberg's case, he, a couple of years ago, he's taken up learning Chinese to be able to expand in the economy. So really, his opportunity cost of gaining education is not too high. And so maybe it's not, maybe the question is not so much on formal degree compared to just maybe one-off education type experiences where you're specializing in one certain thing.
Right, and that's a very important point, in the sense that remember that I so far took the very narrow mind of I just care about the money and how much I can earn, but even that, it's, if you imagine if you think about, I don't know about Zuckerberg, but imagine if you think about the long run that maybe, you will kind of increase the set of things you can do. And so at some point, even if the opportunity costs seem like it's higher now, you can earn more in your alternative option, like working to Google instead of acquiring education. What if, what if you want to do something else later in life, and those skills that you had in school will serve you for that, and you gave this up? How can you price that? And how can you put a number on the fact that just the social interaction that you had with people in your college or in high school, gave you so much more than just like the ability to earn more money. Your social skills are much higher, and maybe the jobs of the future will require social skills much more than they require the automation, and then you just gave this up. So it's very, very hard to measure what the opportunity cost is. It's very hard. This is it's very concrete to think about it in terms of your best next alternative that you can work in, but it's really very hard to measure. And I think this is where I'm going with this also. So, should I go to college if I care about things other than money? So here is an example of why maybe not. Imagine it's kind of, you have three things, good grades, social life, and enough sleep, and you can really only get 2 out of the 3. So you can have good grades and enough sleep, but then you don't have a social life. You can have a good grades and social life, but then you don't have enough sleep. Or you can just have social life and enough sleep, but then you don't have good grades. And if you love all of these things, you like to sleep, you like your social life, then it's a trade-off. It's investing so much in your school and always thinking about your grade and how to improve them, does have a cost in other things that we like. And so that's kind of like a reason that doesn't have to do with money, of why it's kind of like it is costly to think about the grades all the time and to attend and to go to college. But then, of course, there are benefits as well. So, first it's fun, going to college is fun, like you do sports, you meet people, you have friends. So even during college and during high school, like it's kind of fun. Or some people would claim it's fun. And then, but even if you take a more kind of like, this is just, I took this from the World Bank. And basically, it's like trying to make the case of why it's important to educate girls in developing countries. And those states are kind of roughly, are basically kind of basically true from what research basically shows that, like it's a girl that say, educate me and I will be 3 times less likely to have HIV. I will marry on average 3 years later. I will have healthier and fewer children. I will educate my daughter and I will earn 10% more income. So, there are many other things that, school give us that have nothing to do with money, and arguably they are not, and they are not any less important in kind of the well-being that, like later. And so if I put, if I'm trying to put some, look at some research, and again, this is a good point to remind that, correlation does not imply causation. So those are, but again, they don't rule them out either. So these are, I would think about this evidence as suggestive evidence consistent with education being helpful for other things in life as opposed to smoking gun evidence that education causes fabulous things. So this is from a kind of a general social survey that was done in the, ever since the 70s until today. Ask people all sorts of questions, including their education and other aspects of their lives. And basically, this is looking at, showing that educated people are happier. They self-report to be happier. So, of course, we can have an entire talk about how useful are happiness measures of anything. They are certainly problematic, but it's kind of interesting to see. The reason why you see here, so you see that people who have more years of schooling are on average happier. The reason you see here both white bars and black bars, the black bars are before conditioning on their income, and the white bars are after conditioning for their income. So we think the high, so this is an attempt to control for some, like if richer people are happier, has nothing to do with education. People that have more money are happier. This will generate a false negative correlation between education and income that we don't want to attribute to education. So we want to control, to look at people with similar levels of income and see for them if education increased their happiness. That kind of gets a little bit closer at does education make you happier? Controlling for your income. And so I would suggest to look at the white bars as opposed to the black bars. But still, yes, maybe it's after controlling for income, it doesn't look as big, but you can still see that, more educated people report to be happier. Yes?
What's the measurement of happiness?
Yeah, I'm not getting there intentionally just because this is it's kind of like, are you happy? But there are various, for 1 to 7, are you happy? But there are other ways that economists have tried to measure it a little bit more precisely, but there is still a gap between how much you report you're happy versus how much you actually are happy. This is an entire discussion. So again, I would take this as just like with a grain of salt. If you are interested in the literature on happiness, it is kind of interesting and growing. I'm happy to give references, but I want to abstract from the measurements of happiness. But just to say, it's not great, and we don't know exactly what it means. But it's suggestive. I'm just giving those as suggestive evidence. So, for example, if we educated people seem not just happier in general, but they are happier on their job. So if you ask them about if it's so first of all, they are more likely to have a job. The unemployment, people, more educated people are more likely to find a job, less likely to be unemployed. But also, if you ask them about the prestige of their occupation and how satisfied they are with their job, you see that people that are more educated report that their occupation is kind of more prestigious and that they are kind of more and that they are happier with it. And educated people, you start to ask them questions about how much you feel that there's a sense of accomplishment from your job, how much social interaction you have in your job, how much independent you are versus kind of just always having to rely on others. And people, not surprisingly, people that are more educated report that they are more independent, they are able to accomplish more, and they have more social interactions in their work. Now, it's hard to put money on these things, but definitely they are important to many of us. The other thing is schooling. Just 1 second, just to finish that thought. One thing is that schooling might shape preferences. So if you ask, in general, it kind of tend to increase patience. So if you look at this column here, it's like, to what extent do you live for today versus thinking about tomorrow when you make decisions? Educated people are less likely to only think about today. They are more likely to think about the future. More educated people are less likely to have their kids born when they are teenagers. They are more likely to wait. Educated people are much less likely to be arrested. So there are plenty of things that all kind of show the same kind of direction about all these non-monetary things that education buys for you. More social, schooling increases social participation. So if you ask, about voting, and this is kind of related to what Gavin was talking about, did you ever vote? Educated people are more likely to vote. Educated people are more likely to volunteer. They are more likely to report that other people can be trusted, trustworthy, versus being very suspicious about people. I'm not sure if that's good or bad, but I'm just reporting it. On the other hand, though, educated people do wish that they had more free time. So that's kind of a little bit touching at the cost of this. It's like, you ask them, do you always feel rushed? Educated people are more likely to say that they are, our life is very hectic, and you always feel rushed. You wish you had more leisure time at your disposal. You wish you had more time to spend with your friends. And so that is also, that's another dimension that is kind of where education doesn't seem to be very helpful. Work of educated people usually imply more commitment, implies more traveling, more, take more time, and maybe you think about it not just while you are at work, but also later. Goes with you at home. It's stressful, so it does have this element of that people do wish that they had more time. Lisa, sorry, I'm yeah. Yeah. Exactly. You mean that people wish they have more time? No. And more. Yeah. So I don't know if it's so. It could go either. In my mind, it could go either way. On the one hand, because you have more opportunities to interact and social interactions at work, you might meet, more interesting people for you. Maybe you will that will be a force that will make you more likely to spend time with friends. But also life is so busy, and maybe that's more true when you have to travel and you have to work, and you don't just when you finish, the second you finish your work, you can think about other things. You kind of still keep thinking about work, answering email. Maybe that comes at the cost of people having less time to, they have more friends, but they have less time to spend with them. I don't know, so it's not clear, it's a bit surprising. Yeah, I don't know if it's surprising or not, but it seems to be the pattern that we find. So I'm trying to think if this, what? Maybe that's, I'm trying to think, should we take a break now or in 10 minutes? Why don't you, are you happy to give me 10 more minutes to chat, or you really break? Who wants break now? No break? Give me 10 minutes. Just because I think it's because I think it will be an interesting, I'm sure I'll get a couple of questions about this over the break. So let's preempt. That's the question, that's the question. Do good teachers matter? Do good teachers matter? We all had fabulous teachers that inspire us, that we always remember, that care, that that we always have a warm spot for them in our hearts, and they are fabulous. And then we also all had teachers that are kind of less than perfect, and this, I just love this one. It's like, I expect you all to be independent, innovative, critical thinkers who will do exactly what I say. So we all have, but so the question is, and of course it affects your experience during school. If you have a bad teacher or a good teacher, that year looks very different. Question is, does it make a difference later on in life? Does it really matter if the 4th grade teacher that you had was terrible, or was she fabulous? Does it matter? So does it matter for, so again, some things are hard to measure, but so for example, does it matter for your income? Will you earn more money if your 4th grade teacher was fabulous? What do you think? How much? How much more?
I think it depends on the kind of childhood experience that you have. But everybody in there, I think turned on the lights for me.
Yeah, so the idea was, yes, there were teachers who turned on the light for him, and they're fabulous, and he's sure that they will make a difference. I have the same feeling, and it's kind of has been very hard to measure though. So I want to show you one study that I found. It's the most convincing evidence we have so far, and then about this issue, and I want to share with you just a very recent research that have got a lot of attention, and rightfully so. It's a fabulous research. Of course, with its own problems, but it doesn't capture everything. But let me share it with you. So here are 3 first-rate scholars that tracked 2.5 million students over 20 years between 1990 and 2009 in the US. In part, this research we can only do this research now because, of access to data. We have increasing access to data, to big data. You all heard the term big data, recently, and we can now do some, research that is looking at on the large scale data. So this is basically linked. The data is linked school district data to IRS tax data. So you can kind of look at the person. You see the student and the teacher when they were in 4th grade. And then you see how much they earned when they were 30. And because it's so large, you can actually make reasonable conclusions that are not dependent based on biased data or something like that. So basically what they do, of course, the first challenge that they have, how to measure teacher quality. How do you measure teacher quality? It's very hard to measure teacher quality. I mean, it's really, really challenging. I don't think that, and so let me kind of immediately tell you, we don't have perfect ways or even great ways to measure teacher quality. We cannot, all this inspiring, amazing, turn on the light for me is not measurable. Or at least we currently couldn't think of ways to measure it. So what the best way, or one route economists have gone is what's called the value-added measure. And we also have here, Rick Hanushek, in the department in Stanford, who kind of have done a lot of work on this value-added measure. The idea of the value-added measure is, let's look at at a very narrow sense of teacher quality, the impact a teacher has on students' test scores. Now, this is not a perfect measure. It's not just that it's not a perfect measure, it might also introduce some real issues. So if you measure teachers based on how much they increase students' average scores, then you give incentives maybe to teachers to teach for the test. Rather than turn on the light for you, inspire you, they will just kind of really focus on a narrower version of teaching you to the test. And this is well discussed in the literature and acknowledged, and we just, and so no economist with his right mind think that this is how we should evaluate teachers. Basically what it is, though, is an objective measure that is useful to some degree to be used with other ways to measure the quality of teachers, like peer reviews, principals reviews, whatever ways that you know much more than I do about how to assess the quality of teachers. But there is, just like in any other, in sports, And in many other professions, we measure people based on their performance. There is no reason why, like that should not be used as one way to measure performance. It's of course not the only one. So that's the way they measure value added, so with all the pluses and minuses in mind. So what they do is they look at the effect of a good teacher on test scores. So they look at when a high value added teacher enters a school, enters and exits. So for example, maybe she, like somebody was teaching in the fourth grade, and then the next year she went on maternity leave. Let's compare the students who just lost and just gained this teacher. Some people move to another place, move to another state, move to another school. Let's look what happened when such a teacher enters the system. What does he do for grades? So when a high value added, and that's kind of defined as somebody who is in the top 5%, so very, very high, the ones like very high quality, high added value teachers, enter a school, the end of the school year test scores in the grade rise immediately. So let me show you graphically what happens. So this is, again, remember, this is not a couple of teachers, a couple of students, 2.5 million students over 20 years. They have plenty of teachers entering and exiting. These are fourth grade teachers. And so this is a graph that we typically do in economics, where we say here the teacher enters here. And so let's look at what happened the 3 years before that, and what happens the 3 years after that to the grades, to the mean test scores of the cohort. And what you see is that it immediately increase. And this is when you compare it to just a typical other scores in the previous grades that were not affected by these teachers. They are kind of flat. So this is kind of this is how a relatively fabulous teachers increase test scores. Now, then you look. What you do is you look at then what happened in college attendance. Like years later, this is fourth grade. So years later, those students that had higher added value teachers are more likely to enter college. You see that they earn more money when they are 28. Why is it in 28? They wish they could see how much they earn in a later age, because 28 is still an age that you form your education. That's because of the nature of the data. So you have to look at people who are 4 years old. You only have 20 years of data. So at most you could get people to see what happens with them to 28. So this is definitely not eventual earnings. But still, earning at 28 increase for students who have great high school teachers. It's interesting to ask by how much. So what do you think? If I want to translate this, a fabulous teacher increase your earnings at 28. If I just want to translate this aspect into how much useful you are for a student and for a class, for the entire class. Let's try to put numbers on this. Let's try to put a number of how useful, of how much. That's quite a lot. So on average, having a high value added teacher, a fabulous teacher that kind of really increased the grades for everybody, for 1 year raises a child's cumulative lifetime income by $80,000. That's a fourth grade teacher. Okay? That's the equivalent of about $15,000 in present value for somebody who is 12 years old, and if the interest rate is high, 5%, kind of making a conservative assumptions. It's kind of like it's almost like if you enter the first grade and you say, you have a great teacher or just an average teacher, and you should be paying up to $15,000 as a person to get into this great teacher's class. Now, that's from one student's perspective. Let's think about the teacher, though. So first of all, what about having this teacher, this fabulous teacher, for 3 years? Multiply this number by 3. What about having this the teacher value for the entire class? There are 25 students in that class. Multiply how the value that each of them has in expectation by the size of the class. In this sense, I'm saying, then look at the teacher value just in terms of the money that they gain for the students over the entire career of a teacher. So it is in this sense that I tell you that you guys should get paid much more. Yeah. And then, in an attempt to look at a more non-monetary aspect of it, women, you know, like if you look at like a teacher, you know, the value, teacher value added on the percentage of women with teenage birth, you see that students who spend time with a fabulous teacher are less likely to have, you know, like to have children while they are teenagers. So, you know, a lot of evidence that that this is like, you know, like having a great teacher is a great thing. And I think with that, it's a natural place to take like the John Chauvin 10 minutes break that is actually 15 minutes.